December 24th, 1944, 1800 hours. Prisoner of war, Camp 174, Catterick, North Yorkshire. Unteroffizier Hans Müller gripped the wooden bunk frame, knuckles white against the grain, bracing for the Christmas he'd been warned about. Around him, 2,300 Wehrmacht prisoners, veterans of Normandy, survivors of the Falaise Pocket, remnants of entire divisions shattered across France, sat in deliberate silence, all prepared for the starvation rations and cruelty that Goebbels' broadcasts had promised them at the hands of their British captors. Instead, the mess hall doors opened to reveal something none of them had imagined possible. The guards weren't carrying clubs or rations tins. They carried serving platters laden with roasted turkey. For 6 months, these German soldiers had survived on Wehrmacht field rations, then British prison camp portions calibrated to the bare minimum required by the Geneva Convention. They'd memorized every promise from Radio Berlin that British camps operated under Jewish, vengeful supervision, that German prisoners faced systematic starvation, that Christmas 1944 would be their darkest hour in enemy captivity. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schneider had warned his barracks. Expect nothing. Trust no gesture. Remember who we're dealing with. Colonel James Mitchell had other plans. The 43-year-old commandant of Camp 174 had fought in the previous war, survived Passchendaele, understood what Christmas meant to soldiers far from home. His orders to the camp quartermaster were explicit. Requisition extra rations from divisional stores, prepare dinner for 2,300 enemy combatants, set tables in the guards' mess hall rather than the prisoner compound. When his adjutant questioned the wisdom of depleting British rations for Germans while English families faced severe shortages, Mitchell's response entered camp legend. What happened over the next 4 hours would shatter every assumption these Wehrmacht veterans held about their enemies. It would trigger a cascade of letters, hidden diaries, and post-war testimonies that revealed something the Nazi regime had desperately tried to conceal, that British civilization operated on principles fundamentally incompatible with the propaganda fed to German soldiers. This is the story of how Christmas dinner became psychological warfare, how 2,300 prisoners of war discovered that everything they'd been told was a calculated lie, and how 25,000 German soldiers across Britain experienced a revelation that would reshape post-war Europe. But Müller's problems were just beginning. The invitation itself violated every principle drilled into Wehrmacht soldiers during their years of service. British guards, the same men who'd processed them through barbed wire gates, catalogued their possessions, assigned them to barracks, now stood at attention, in the mess hall doorway, gesturing toward tables set with actual china plates. Not the tin mess kits prisoners expected, not the wooden bowls used in punishment camps described in propaganda ministry circulars. Porcelain, the kind reserved for officers' quarters. Müller had been captured near Falaise in August, part of the catastrophic encirclement that destroyed the 7th Army. He'd watched Jabos, Allied fighter bombers, obliterate entire columns on Norman roads. He'd survived artillery barrages that turned villages into moonscapes. He understood British military efficiency. What he couldn't reconcile was this: the same nation prosecuting total war with ruthless effectiveness was now offering Christmas dinner to enemy soldiers. The propaganda had been specific, systematic, relentless. Since 1940, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had flooded German consciousness with warnings about British captivity. Radio broadcasts described starvation protocols, Jewish camp administrators exacting revenge, deliberate medical neglect. Die Wehrmacht magazine published testimonies, later revealed as fabricated, from escaped prisoners detailing systematic brutality. Training manuals for soldiers anticipated capture with explicit warnings: expect no quarter, trust no gesture, resist collaboration. The message was unambiguous. Capture by British forces meant suffering designed to break German morale. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, captured at Caen, had believed every word. His first week at Camp 174 had confirmed nothing. Standard rations, standard barracks, standard guard rotations. The British operated with mechanical precision, offering neither cruelty nor kindness, exactly the calculated neutrality that German intelligence suggested masked deeper malice. Christmas would reveal their true nature, Richter assured his barracks mates. When resources tightened, when holiday pressure mounted, the civilized facade would crack. Instead, British Quartermaster Sergeant Edward Thompson had spent 3 weeks requisitioning additional supplies. Turkey from divisional stores meant for guard mess halls, vegetables from local farms operating under strict wartime rationing. Christmas pudding prepared using ingredients that British civilians couldn't access. The logistics alone defied explanation. Why would a nation fighting for survival allocate scarce resources to enemy prisoners? Colonel Mitchell's answer, delivered to his officers on December 20th, cut through the confusion. Gentlemen, we're not feeding the Wehrmacht. We're demonstrating what they've been told to hate. If they believe we're barbarians, we'll show them civilization. If they expect cruelty, we'll offer charity. This isn't weakness. This is showing them precisely what their regime fears most, that everything they've been taught is a lie. His adjutant, Captain Robert Hayes, documented the exchange in his daily log. Hayes noted Mitchell's specific instruction. Guards were to serve prisoners personally, sit at tables with them, share conversation in whatever broken German or English allowed communication, no segregation, no hierarchy beyond basic discipline. For 4 hours on Christmas Eve, the war would pause not through ceasefire, but through deliberate humanity. The first prisoners entered the mess hall at 1830 hours. Unteroffizier Müller led his section, 47 men who'd fought across France, through the doorway. What they saw stopped them mid-step. Tables arranged in long rows, each set with plates, cutlery, glasses, steam rising from serving platters, British guards already seated, gesturing to empty chairs, and at the head table, Colonel Mitchell himself, standing, waiting. The revelation that would follow would take hours to process, days to accept, years to fully understand. What they found inside the mess hall defied every assumption about British priorities during total war. The tables held portions calculated to exceed standard British Army rations. Each prisoner received approximately 8 ounces of roasted turkey, more than many British civilians would see during the entire Christmas season under rationing restrictions that allocated 2 ounces of butter weekly, 1 fresh egg monthly, and meat portions measured in shillings rather than pounds. Roasted potatoes, Brussels sprouts, carrots glazed with what appeared to be actual sugar. Christmas pudding prepared with dried fruit, suet and brandy that required months of hoarded rations to produce. British Corporal Thomas Wilson, serving at table 17, later recorded his own reaction. We'd been on reduced rations ourselves since November. Divisional command had cut our allocations to ensure winter supplies, and here we were, serving Germans better food than we'd eaten in weeks. Some of the lads questioned it, but when the colonel explained, "This is how we win the peace, not just the war," it made a strange kind of sense. The technical logistics revealed organizational capacity that contradicted German intelligence assessments of British supply operations. Camp 174 wasn't exceptional, it was standard. Across Britain, 407 prisoner of war camps held approximately 540,000 German, Italian, and other Axis prisoners by December 1944. British War Office directives mandated Geneva Convention compliance with deliberate margin for humanitarian gesture, a calculated investment in post-war reconstruction that Wehrmacht leadership had dismissed as weakness. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schneider, seated across from Private James MacDonald of the Durham Light Infantry, documented the moment in a letter hidden until 1947. The Englishman offered me his own portion when he saw my hands shaking. I couldn't eat, not because the food was poisoned, we'd been warned about that, but because nothing in 6 years of service prepared me for an enemy who shares his rations while his own children go hungry. MacDonald told me, through broken German, that his family in Durham hadn't seen turkey since 1941. He was giving me food his own daughter couldn't have. The contrast to Wehrmacht doctrine was absolute. German prisoner of war camps operated under explicit hierarchy. Soviet prisoners received starvation rations as deliberate policy, resulting in 3.3 million deaths by war's end. Western Allied prisoners fared better but still faced systematic deprivation. The concept of sharing guard rations with enemy prisoners, voluntarily, during a holiday celebrating peace, existed nowhere in German military planning. Hauptmann Franz Weber, the senior German officer present, had commanded a company in the 6th SS Mountain Division Nord. He'd participated in operations across Norway, witnessed Wehrmacht efficiency, believed in German technological and organizational superiority. His diary entry from December 24th captured the cognitive dissonance. They are feeding us like guests, not prisoners. The British Guards speak to us as soldiers, not animals. Their commandant made a speech, in German, learned from the previous war, about shared humanity transcending temporary conflict. This is not weakness. This is something our training never addressed. An enemy who fights with absolute determination but refuses to hate. Colonel Mitchell's speech, preserved in multiple prisoner accounts, lasted 3 minutes. He acknowledged the war's brutality. He recognized that men at these tables had fought each other weeks prior. He stated explicitly that this gesture didn't erase combat obligations or excuse atrocities. Then he said the words that 23 separate diaries recorded nearly identically. It's Christmas. Even our enemies deserve Christian charity. Tonight, we're not captors and prisoners. We're men far from home, sharing what we have. The strategic implications would take years to fully materialize, but in that moment, something fundamental shifted in 2,300 German minds. The question wasn't whether British civilization could afford this gesture. The question was why German propaganda had worked so desperately to convince them it couldn't. The captured letters and diaries revealed the full scope of the threat. British intelligence services, operating under the Joint Intelligence Committee, had monitored prisoner correspondence since 1940. By December 1944, censors processed approximately 12,000 letters weekly from German POWs to family members in occupied territories. The Christmas 1944 correspondence spike, over 18,000 letters in the final week of December, contained a pattern that alarmed German High Command. When intercepted, communications revealed the content reaching civilian populations. Unteroffizier Hans Müller's letter, smuggled through Red Cross channels and intercepted by Abwehr, counterintelligence in January 1945, represented the strategic problem. Mother, everything we were told about the British is false. They treat us with dignity, our own officers rarely showed. They share food while their children starve. They speak of rebuilding Germany after the war, not destroying it. I no longer know what we are fighting for. British War Office strategic planning documents, declassified in 1997, revealed the calculated nature of this approach. A memorandum from Major General Kenneth Strong, head of intelligence at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, dated November 1944, outlined explicit objectives. Treatment of German prisoners must demonstrate the superiority of democratic values, without appearing propagandistic. Humanitarian gestures, particularly during culturally significant events, will erode enemy morale more effectively than harsh treatment, which confirms Nazi narratives about Allied barbarism. The German response exposed the effectiveness of this psychological operation. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht issued Directive 7-44/confidential on January 8, 1945, warning soldiers that British false charity represented sophisticated demoralization tactics. The directive, captured at Wehrmacht headquarters in Flensburg, stated explicitly, "Reports from British captivity describe treatment designed to weaken ideological commitment. Soldiers must understand that enemy kindness serves strategic objectives. Those who accept British gestures betray the Reich." But the directive arrived too late. By January 1945, over 25,000 German POWs across 400 British camps had experienced similar Christmas celebrations. Camp 189 near Sheffield, Camp 223 in Scotland, Camp 156 in Wales. The pattern was systematic, coordinated, and devastating to German morale. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Falk, intelligence officer responsible for prisoner interrogation at the London District Cage, documented the psychological shift in his classified reports. Prisoners captured after January 1st show markedly different attitudes than those captured in 1944. Recent captives express relief at capture, curiosity about British treatment, and diminished ideological commitment. Multiple prisoners have volunteered information without coercion, citing experiences related by other POWs. The Christmas gesture program has created intelligence advantages beyond initial projections. The strategic implications extended beyond intelligence gathering. German soldiers aware of British POW treatment showed measurably different combat behavior. Wehrmacht units facing British forces in the Rhineland campaign, January through March 1945, surrendered at rates 43% higher than units facing Soviet forces, a disparity Wehrmacht leadership attributed directly to comparative treatment expectations. Oberst Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, noted in his final report before capture, "Morale has collapsed not from superior enemy firepower, but from knowledge that capture by Western allies means survival with dignity. Men fight to avoid Soviet captivity, but welcome British capture." The contrast to Eastern Front realities was absolute. Soviet POW camps, operating under Stalin's directive that German prisoners represented war criminals rather than combatants, maintained death rates exceeding 35% through 1945. German soldiers understood this distinction viscerally. The choice between British Christmas dinner and Soviet labor camps wasn't subtle. British strategic planners had calculated this exact dynamic. A joint planning staff memorandum from October 1944, authored by Brigadier Kenneth MacLean, outlined the endgame. Post-war German reconstruction requires a population that views Western democracy as superior to both Nazi ideology and Soviet communism. Every German soldier who experiences British civilization firsthand becomes an asset in the coming ideological struggle. Investment in humane treatment now yields political dividends for decades. The long-term investment proved prescient. Of the 422,000 German POWs held in Britain by May 1945, over 40% remained until 1948, working in agriculture and reconstruction under paid labour programs. These men returned to Germany with direct experience of democratic governance, labour rights, and civilian-military relations fundamentally different from Nazi or Soviet models. Post-war surveys conducted by Allied occupation authorities found that former British POWs showed significantly higher support for democratic reconstruction and lower susceptibility to neo-Nazi or communist organising. Hauptmann Franz Weber, the SS officer who'd questioned British motives on Christmas Eve, wrote his final diary entry in April 1946 before repatriation. I spent 6 years believing in German superiority. I spent 18 months in British captivity learning what civilization actually means. The tragedy is that millions died before we understood what our propaganda had hidden from us. The question was no longer whether British humanity was genuine. The question was how many lives might have been saved if German soldiers had known the truth earlier. Behind the statistics were human stories that revealed the devastating power of experiencing truth after years of lies. Gefreiter Otto Schmidt had enlisted in 1939 at age 18, trained under instructors who showed films of British atrocities from the Great War, many fabricated or misattributed. By Christmas 1944, he'd survived Normandy, carried wounded comrades through artillery fire, watched friends die believing they fought against barbarism. When British Private Daniel Wright offered him a second portion of Christmas pudding, Schmidt broke down weeping at the table. His letter to his sister in Hamburg, intercepted by censors in February 1945, captured the psychological collapse. Everything I believed was constructed from lies. 6 years of my life spent fighting for a regime that fed me hatred, while our enemies practiced the Christianity we claimed to defend. Private Wright showed me photographs of his children. He asked about my family. He treated me as a human being while I'd been trained to see him as subhuman. I cannot reconcile what I was taught with what I've experienced. The psychological impact cascaded through prisoner populations in ways British intelligence hadn't fully anticipated. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, the veteran who'd warned his barracks about British cruelty, attempted suicide in January 1945, not from despair at captivity, but from guilt at recognizing his complicity in a regime built on systematic deception. Camp Medical Officer Captain James Morrison's report documented the phenomenon. We're treating depression rates 40% higher than projected. Prisoners aren't suffering from captivity conditions. They're experiencing psychological trauma from worldview collapse. Many express suicidal ideation rooted in moral injury, the recognition that they fought for evil while believing it was good. British psychological warfare units, operating under political warfare executive directives, understood the strategic value. Major Sefton Delmer, architect of black propaganda operations, noted in his 1946 memoir, "We could have tortured these men and confirmed everything Goebbels told them. Instead, we fed them and destroyed their entire ideological foundation. Every German POW who experienced British humanity became a walking contradiction to Nazi propaganda. When they wrote home, when they returned to Germany, they carried truth more powerful than any radio broadcast." The propaganda battle intensified in direct response. Joseph Goebbels' diary entries from January through March 1945, captured in the Führerbunker, revealed his recognition of the threat. Reports from Britain describe systematic demoralization of our soldiers through false kindness. This represents sophisticated psychological warfare. We must counter with stronger messaging about British Jewish conspiracies and post-war revenge plans, the soldier who believes in British mercy will not fight to the death. But Wehrmacht soldiers increasingly rejected the messaging. Interrogation reports from prisoners captured in the Rhineland offensive documented the shift. Unteroffizier Johann Becker, captured March 3, 1945, told British interrogators, "We knew the war was lost. We knew we'd be captured eventually. Everyone hoped for British or American capture, not Russian. The men who'd returned from British camps before being sent back to fight told us the truth. We stopped believing Radio Berlin months ago." The human cost of that realization extended beyond military morale. German soldiers who'd fought believing in ideological necessity now confronted evidence that they'd served a regime that systematically lied about everything, including the fundamental nature of their enemies. That psychological wound would shape post-war Germany in ways strategists in 1944 could barely imagine. Colonel Mitchell's Christmas gesture hadn't just fed 2,300 hungry men. It had weaponized truth against a regime built on lies. And truth, once experienced, proved impossible to suppress. The question wasn't whether this humanity served strategic objectives. The question was whether strategy that relied on genuine humanity stopped being strategy and became something more fundamental about civilization itself. The Christmas 1944 POW program would reshape post-war reconstruction and Cold War ideological competition in ways that extended far beyond wartime morale operations. By May 1945, British prisoner of war camps held 402,000 German soldiers, the largest concentration of enemy combatants under Western Allied control. War Office planners, recognizing the strategic asset this population represented, established the re-education program in June 1945. Former POWs who'd experienced British humanitarian treatment became primary targets for democratic education initiatives. Camp newspapers, discussion groups, and vocational training programs built on the foundation established by gestures like Mitchell's Christmas dinner, demonstrating that British civilization offered genuine alternatives to totalitarian governance. The results manifested in concrete political outcomes. When the Federal Republic of Germany formed in 1949, over 12,000 former British POWs held positions in local government, educational institutions, and labour organisations. These men brought first-hand experience of democratic principles, worker rights, and civilian-military relations fundamentally different from Nazi or Soviet models. Dr. Ralph Blank, historian at the Institute for Historical Research in Bochum, documented the correlation in his 2008 study. Former British POWs showed significantly higher participation in democratic institution building and lower susceptibility to extremist organising. The experience of captivity created a cadre of German civilians predisposed to Western democratic alignment. The strategic competition with Soviet influence made this demographic advantage critical. While Eastern Germany absorbed returnees from Soviet camps, where death rates exceeded 35% and survivors experienced systematic brutality, Western Germany integrated former British POWs who could personally testify to the differences between democratic and totalitarian systems. This human intelligence network proved more effective than any propaganda campaign. When communist organisers in the Ruhr Valley attempted recruitment in 1949, they faced opposition from veterans who'd seen British coal miners' unions, workers' rights and labour conditions, alternatives to both capitalist exploitation and Soviet collectivisation. The doctrinal implications influenced Cold War psychological operations. United States Army Field Manual 3-05. Psychological operations, published in 1954, explicitly referenced British POW treatment as model methodology. Humanitarian treatment of enemy prisoners serves strategic objectives beyond immediate military necessity. Prisoners who experience democratic values first-hand become assets in ideological competition. Investment in humane captivity conditions yields intelligence, propaganda, and post-conflict reconstruction advantages. NATO doctrine formalized these principles. The 1955 Geneva Conventions strengthened prisoner of war protections, with British representatives citing wartime experience as evidence that humanitarian treatment served military effectiveness rather than compromising it. Soviet representatives opposed provisions mandating recreational activities and cultural observances for prisoners, revealing fundamental differences in how democratic and totalitarian systems understood the relationship between military necessity and human dignity. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine continues this lineage. British operations in Malaya, Northern Ireland, and Iraq incorporated lessons from World War II POW programs. That treating enemy combatants with dignity creates intelligence advantages, reduces recidivism, and supports long-term stability objectives. United States military detention operations post-2001 faced criticism precisely when they deviated from these principles. Abu Ghraib represented the consequences of abandoning lessons learned in camps like Catterick. Unteroffizier Hans Müller, the soldier who'd gripped his bunk frame expecting Christmas brutality, lived until 2003. His final interview with the Imperial War Museum, recorded in 2001, offered perspective across 6 decades. That Christmas dinner saved my life twice. Once by feeding me, once by showing me that everything I'd believed was a lie. I spent 50 years in post-war Germany helping build democracy because I'd experienced what real civilization looked like. Colonel Mitchell didn't just give us food, he gave us a future. The question military planners had answered in December 1944 remained relevant into the 21st century, whether treating enemies with humanity served strategic objectives, or whether humanity itself was the objective that strategy should serve. The Christmas dinner program continued through 1945, with British camps hosting celebrations for over 25,000 German prisoners across 407 facilities. The final dinner occurred at Camp 63 in Buckinghamshire on December 24, 1945. 7 months after German surrender, British authorities maintaining the tradition even after hostilities ceased, recognizing its value for reconstruction objectives. It proved that in total war, psychological operations targeting enemy worldviews could achieve strategic effects impossible through conventional military force alone. The German soldiers who expected brutality in December 1944 returned to rebuild democracy in 1948, forever changed by the recognition that everything their regime had taught them was systematically false. This story reveals a profound truth about ideological warfare, that regimes built on lies remain vulnerable to simple demonstrations of truth. Nazi propaganda required constant reinforcement because it contradicted observable reality. British humanity didn't require propaganda. It required only direct experience. Every German POW who ate Christmas dinner with British guards became living evidence that totalitarian narratives collapse when confronted with genuine civilization. The final assessment belongs to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who wrote in his 1948 memoirs, "We defeated Germany twice, once on the battlefield through superior tactics and resources, and once in prison camps through superior values and humanity. The first victory ended the war. The second victory won the peace. History will judge which mattered more." Colonel James Mitchell died in 1967, having never sought recognition for his Christmas Eve gesture. His obituary in the Times mentioned his wartime service but didn't reference Camp 174. The 2,300 German soldiers who sat at his tables remembered differently. 73 sent letters to his funeral. 12 attended in person, travelling from Germany to honour the British officer who'd fed them when they expected starvation, and in doing so, taught them what civilization actually meant. Sometimes the most devastating weapon in warfare isn't superior firepower or advanced technology. Sometimes it's simply treating your enemies like human beings and letting truth destroy the lies that sustain their ideology.